Gary Lineker's suspension has prompted loads of excoriating attacks on the BBC and the Tory government. One of the most memorable was this from former England player John Barnes.
You've said that you're 100% behind Gary Lineker. Why is that?
Well, first of all, there are two issues. I was listening to the gentleman before. In terms of impartiality, I don't know when the BBC have ever been impartial. In fact, BBC's reporting on the Qatar World Cup was anything but impartial. So it seems that they want to pick and choose when they want to be impartial. Criticizing others or criticizing other countries or other political parties or other religions seems to be okay. But of course, if you then criticize what goes on in this country, then it seems that they will then come out with this impartiality rule. The second thing, which a lot of people took offense to, is the perception that Gary was equating Britain to Nazi Germany, which he wasn't. What he said was the language used regarding the refugees is similar to the language used in 1930s Germany, which it was. And of course, we can see how that ended up. And Gary is not saying, I'm not saying that that's how it's going to end up. But of course, the language used in terms of creating this perception of an unworthy refugee, very much like the Jews were unworthy to be German and Germans were better than Jews. That was the language that was used. And that's what we're saying here. We're talking about the refugees coming over, and the language used towards the refugees coming over on boats in terms of them being rapists, in terms of them being criminals, is different to the refugees from the Ukraine. And that is what we have to address. And that is what I want Gary and everybody supporting him to talk about. Us talking about the worthiness of different groups of people, because that's how discrimination starts.
That was really interesting. Sort of John Barnes there putting forward a defence of using analogies such as the language being used now and language in the 1930s. It's a debate that seems to keep recurring in British politics. I think it's because of Twitter, right? And potentially also because of the rows surrounding the Labour Party over the last few years. Should 1930s analogies be made about language? Should we not compare something which is distinct and different in its horror to what we're seeing now? I mean, do you have any strong feelings here?
Yeah, I do have really strong feelings here. I mean, look, first, and to put this right at the top, I'm not in favour of gratuitous comparisons with the Nazis or with 1930s Germany's, like simply to discredit your political opponents, all right? I think that's wrong. But I think that this comparison was far from gratuitous. You're looking at an immigration bill which would detain or deport asylum seekers if they don't come through regular means. And there aren't many safe or legal routes. The ones that exist are highly, highly limited to specific countries. So if you're from, I don't know, Eritrea, tough luck. If you're from Iran, tough luck. But if you're from Ukraine, you'll be treated a little bit more like a human being. That is the very essence of discrimination. You're talking about a bill which would mean if you were a victim of sex trafficking, for instance, and you came here through irregular means, that you wouldn't have access to support from the government's modern slavery scheme. You're basically treated like such a criminal that it doesn't matter that you are being sexually and economically abused and exploited. You're looking at a bill which also wants to basically incarcerate people who are fleeing from war and persecution and other forms of suffering in former military barracks. Now, I think the minute you start talking about locking migrants up in camps, it is wholly appropriate to make comparisons to 1930s Germany. And the reason why it's so meaningful and the reason why it's so powerful is because we do have this history in our own continent where we can see this process of dehumanization going through all the steps and ending up in extermination. That's why it's so meaningful. And that's what the phrase never again is about. While the Holocaust is singular, never again is meant to be universal. It's supposed to be a call to action and alertness for all of us to make sure that that process of dehumanization doesn't ever happen again. Now, the reason why it's being litigated in this way, I think, is entirely to do with what's happened in the last few years when it comes to the Labour Party, which is that anti-Semitism is meant to be solely a crime perpetuated by the left. That's why we've had this bizarre subplot this weekend. We've got people like Peter Hitchens claiming that the Nazis were really left-wing. That's been a means to delegitimize the left for the past few years. You've got the IHRA definition, which I was against at the time and I'm still against now, where one of the examples is about drawing comparisons between the actions of the state of Israel and the actions of the Nazis. And from that, you get extrapolated a rule, which is to make any sort of comparison with the fascist government of the 1930s is seen as to undermine the singularity of the Holocaust and to be a form of anti-Semitism in itself. So you can see how this disproportionately benefits right-wing governments, right-wing ideologues, right-wing papers, because number one, it means that you are forcing restrictions on people, stopping them from connecting the dots between present day dehumanization of vulnerable people and the history in Europe of the dehumanization of vulnerable people. And you're setting different rules for the left to play by. You're saying anytime you make these comparisons, you are anti Semitic. Well, there were plenty of specious and offensive Nazi comparisons being made when it came to Jeremy Corbyn. Alan Sugar tweeted a photo where Jeremy Corbyn was photoshopped in next to Hitler. You know, Momentum and the Labour Party were regularly compared to the Nazis. In fact, you had somebody go on LBC and claim that Jeremy Corbyn wanted to reopen Auschwitz, and none of those things were seen as a form of insulting or denigrating or trivializing the Holocaust, simply because it was using that language to smear and to tarnish and to delegitimize the left. So I think it's totally cynical, the way that this is being mobilized. And again, my point isn't, anyone should be able to make gratuitous and specious comparisons, but that actually this is a really meaningful history to draw comparisons with, particularly here in Europe. And that when you see pieces of legislation where you're looking at a group of people and you go, your human rights don't matter, I think it is entirely appropriate to make that comparison.
It seems to me to sort of be a little bit elitist is when historical comparisons have to be perfect. Because when I think about what I learned in history in secondary school, right, I did do A-level, and obviously, you know, I work in journalism, so my history knowledge is not, it's not great, but it's not appalling. What I learned in history in secondary school was essentially the Second World War and then some slavery. Both of those are extreme examples from history. But for lots of people, that's going to be, you know, they're the key historical analogies to draw because they're the only bits of history you actually get taught in secondary school, right? So it seems to me, it's like, no, you have to go for something more specific. It's like, well, what if people don't know anything more specific? Then you should not make historical comparisons. It seems to me to be rather exclusionary in terms of public discourse, where you have to have total knowledge of recent history so that you can make perfect comparisons, not clunky ones.